Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on graphic design principle for scientists. The webinar is taking place in the context of the Research Communication Week, organized by Ca' Foscari University of Venice, a week full of events and training activities for researchers, and not only researchers, aimed at improving their outreach skills for reaching the society and help their research to have an impact. I am Alessandra Mazzai. I'm part of the communication office at the CMCC Foundation, the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, a research center that focuses its activities on the study of our climate system and its interaction with the society. The CMCC is glad to co-organize this interesting webinar. I'm very happy today to introduce our outstanding speaker and science communicator, Francesco Fiondella, who is Director of Communications at Columbia University's International Institute for Climate and Society. We have the pleasure to collaborate with Francesco, and we are more than sure that you will enjoy today's presentation. Francesco Fiondella has worked as a science writer and photographer for more than 15 years, and is especially interested in bringing science and scientists deeper into the public sphere through collaboration with artists. He also teaches courses on science communication and strategic climate change communication at Columbia University's Climate School. He has also worked as a graphic editor and staff writer at the Wall Street Journal. Today, Francesco Fiondella will give us suggestions on how to communicate through presentations, posters, data visualization. So after Francesco's presentation, you will have the chance to pose some questions. You can write them directly into the Q&A panel of your Zoom app as they come, even during the presentation, and we will pose them to Francesco at the end of his talk. We have more than 200 people present today at the moment. We want to thank you all for your interest and involvement. Now it's time, finally, to give the floor to our speaker, Francesco Fiondella. Welcome, Francesco. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thanks for that really nice, lovely introduction. Hi, good morning, everyone. It's still a little early in my part of the world here, but the sun is rising right in front of me. So perhaps I might have to put the shades down in a second because I'm going to get blasted by that beautiful morning light. Very happy to be here. Let me just share my desktop so we can get started. Okay, I think you can all see that. Okay. Yeah, so I would like to thank Alessandra and Enrico for inviting me to participate in this, and for the University of Ca' Foscari in Venice for organizing this, as many other really amazing seminars and webinars on these topics of research communications for Research Comms Week. So yeah, so let's get started. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about myself a little bit and what motivates me to bring up some of these issues about visual communications. Then I will share why I think some of you, or most of you, hopefully in the audience, are tuning in. And then we'll go through a presentation and leave about 15 minutes of time for questions and discussions. So a little bit about me, as Alessandra mentioned, and where sort of what I do and where sort of I've come from. But I am the communications director for this institute that's about 50 scientists. It's part of Columbia and part of the new Columbia Climate School, although we've been around now for, in fact, we just celebrated 25 years. And the International Research Institute for Climate and Society really works around the world to help governments and climate and sectoral institutions like the Ministry of Agriculture and Water Management and and energy to improve the way that they utilize climate prediction and climate information in for real world kind of decision making for better outcomes in terms of food security and public health, sustainable energy, and other sort of drives towards sustainability. And as Alessandra mentioned, I had a life as doing information graphics back in the day when it was mostly print, and this is for the Wall Street Journal. I also am the avid photographer, and I really spent a lot of time thinking about ways that we can communicate, especially about science or the topics that scientists like to study over the years. And I feel like, as probably many of you share this, that photography is just one of these very powerful ways to get out information and connections, and make connections between the science realm and the non-science realm, the public realm. And I also like to collaborate with artists. Here's a picture of my good friend and graphic designer friend, Nilu Muchala. She and I worked during the quarantine on a collaborative project between her illustrations and my writing and poetry. And we put together some exhibitions around the New England area last summer. And that's a lot of fun. And it just sort of keeps my brain operating in a slightly different space. But I think that really helps inform and help me do my work better. And then I do fun things like imagining a pinup calendar with climate scientists becoming fashion models for a day, and as a way of just public engagement with science and getting people to understand more about the kind of work and the kind of people who do the work that are so important for our society, right, especially right now, and in thinking about the climate crisis. So that's about a little bit about me, but also just to say that I work with scientists every day. I have for 15 years. I'm married to a scientist. Two of my closest friends are scientists. I have a couple of really close friends who are graphic designers as well. So my mind is thinking a lot in ways that we can use visual communications, and not in sort of very advanced necessarily ways, but just using what we have at our disposal to communicate visually better, and helping scientists especially do that more effectively. So that's sort of why I'm here. I think I find that I work, as maybe many of the communications people that might be in the audience, we work with very talented, passionate people who are very deeply committed to their work, and are actually can be quite eloquent in how they talk about their work. But when it comes time to giving presentations or doing, explaining things in a visual way, either on slides or on a poster, some of those qualities, right, become hidden from the audiences because of lack of time or lack of attention to details that are in the visual realm and design and layout. And so that's really why I like to work in this realm and help people be better at it with just some simple principles. So here are some assumptions that I'm making about the majority of you in the audience. You're scientists or science student or researcher. You're probably early career. You work in maybe, if not a science field, a technical field where you have to communicate topics that are technical in nature. You're not a designer. I think if you are, many of these things will be very, very basic to you, because the needs of a designer for visual communication, and obviously in the needs of people that are not designers for communication, are very different and aren't as complex for the non-designers to put in. And you also have this interest, right, and see value in reaching as many people as possible about your work, about other science colleagues' work, but in general, just getting out the message and the key points that you want to make about the work that you've committed, your studies to or your career to. And then that you also value when others you hear, or even when you do it yourself, like when you are able to communicate in these clear and engaging ways, that you see the difference that can make. And then finally, that you're all busy. And so, obviously we have, the better part of 30 to 40 minutes to talk about some of these key principles. And we're not going to, explore an MFA's worth of design principles in this time. And neither do we need to. I think what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to really just get across some simple things that even now, even recently, in the last few weeks, as I'll show you in some examples, I still have to manage and sort of work with scientists to refine their presentations. So these simple principles that I'll share are still reflect common issues that I deal with and have dealt with for many years. And so, so that's where we are. So let's just a note about slides and posters and even to a point like information graphics or other graphics that we commonly deal with. So, slides and slide decks and presentations and posters are two of the most common and visually important ways that scientists will be communicating about their research, or science graduate students, for example, will be communicating. And these are great opportunities to get out there and start presenting your work to a variety of audiences. Now, in terms of thinking about layout and design and other visual aspects, the problems that I find, and to a great extent, the solutions to those problems are pretty much the same for making a slide or making a poster or making some other sort of visual materials. The difference being, of course, when you're talking about slides are used in presentations, and presentations are themselves performances that need to really connect and harmonize with what is being shown on the screen and what is being said. And so to that end, they require practice and a lot of rehearsal to pull off effectively. So the people that do it very well, I can assure you, didn't put it together the night before and just kind of speak off the cuff. That is a very, very rare breed of person that can do that. But most of us have very busy lives, and that we oftentimes don't get a chance to make the presentation coalesce. So that's the slides. Posters don't have necessarily those challenges, but of course a poster has very limited real estate, right? And so they have to stand on their own generally, and so it presents their own kind of design considerations. But for the most part, what I'm going to show you applies to both. In terms of thinking. And I might have a few, if we have time at the end, just have a few slides to talk about maybe some things that are specific to posters. But throughout, if there's differences, I'll make a point to it. But here are some of the common problems, right, that I see all the time, right? So in general, the main points are sometimes hard to find and follow on a page or on a slide or on a poster. Each slide that you put up or a poster should have an objective, right? And should have a series of key points and messages that you want to make. And they should be very, very easy to figure out. You don't want people to have to do a lot of heavy lifting or work to get to there. The biggest thing is too much text, and actually too much of everything is the first thing that I always have to that I encounter. So a lot of times I'll get a page way too overflowing with information. That's more of a challenge to address in a poster because you have limited space, and with slides you can address some of that by either removing what you think is unnecessary text and content, but breaking it up into multiple slides. Whether you have a slide, if you have to give a 10-minute talk, whether you have 10 slides to tell your talk or 50 slides shouldn't matter in how long you take to go through those slides. Oftentimes I'll have a slide that I can make or maybe 5 slides that I can sort of run through very quickly, but in doing so, in breaking that information up, of course, we allow the audience, the viewers, to digest that information in small chunks and bites so that they can follow along more clearly. And then there are things that I call kind of like sticky things, where our brain can't help but focus on things like poor use of grammar or use of jargon or acronyms and misspellings that might be minor and might not be frequent, but when they do happen, they just kind of break our attention as an audience member just enough to break the flow and not listen as carefully as we would. And that's just, has to, and that's true for even written materials as well. And so oftentimes I work to make sure, especially with technical terms and acronyms, as we probably have heard in other seminars, and communications people all over the world will rise and chant, it's the audience. So understanding who it is that you're delivering your presentation or your poster to really matters in terms of how much jargon and technical language or acronyms you can get away with. And then graphics, and by graphics, I mean information graphics, diagrams, charts and plots and data visualizations that are put up on a screen or on a poster, but then are either way too complicated for the audience and don't serve to reduce complexity and help people understand your points, or they are not. Sometimes we have to put those things because the manner our research demands, sometimes very complicated plots, but when we have to do that, oftentimes we don't give those plots enough time to be on the screen, or enough explanation either in our talking points or the way that we guide somebody on the screen, or in a poster where we point out certain parts of a graphic and give people, a sort of a path to come to understand what's being shown. That's when I think we have an issue, because the graphics can be very relevant, but need to be explained at times. And at times that becomes a problem for a slide, and you lose people when you put something up that they can't make heads or tails of. And then the topic of the sort of next few slides are going to be about organization and visual language and structure. Like I mentioned before, it should be very clear as soon as you put up your slide, or as soon as somebody walks up to your poster, what the most important thing is that you want them to read first or see first, and then following a path to the end. And you do that through different sort of characteristics of design that you apply, through type, or through color, through image, through contrast, and all of the other, through size. All of these things matter. Okay, so the first concept is that we often hear about in the design world and in the sort of user UX world of web design, is employing what's called visual hierarchy or schema or visual logic, right? And so, and we want to do that for our materials as well. So visual hierarchy is this principle of arranging elements to show the order of importance on a material, on a page, on a slide, or what have you. Why do we do that? Because it controls the delivery of the experience that we are providing to the reader, to the audience. It controls the way that the information that the reader sort of flows through the information and the content on a page, and it keeps the person in this state of attention, and it keeps your presentation going with having good flow. So a reader should easily be able to tell where to go from one section to the next, and your job is to really guide that reader either through your design or through what you say and what you point out on the page. You could do it with numbers. Sometimes it's very simple as saying, here's number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3, and then people can tune into that. But it's also done through different elements that we'll get to in a second. And so good visual logic avoids any unnecessary elements on the page. It could be, a lot of, maybe logos that are just thrown up there that sort of, are put up there because somebody feels a need to put them up there, but don't really move the narrative forward. It could be badly cropped photos that, have a lot of distracting elements in their background that you can sort of get rid of. good hierarchy also uses a structure. Obviously, it's a hierarchy to emphasize main points, and that structure could be through, like I said, through typography or through different sizings and other applications. And then the other thing is, one thing that I often do, and I ask others to do, is when you look at your slide or your poster, squint, just sort of squint your eyes, and then you'll be able to see, without focusing too much on the specific content that's on the slide, what's drawing your attention and where it is on the page, on the area. Because you could pick up on things like, oh, well, we have this, this object on the page that's literally screaming visually at us, and it's not really that important. So how do I minimize that volume that piece is giving and maximize the volume of the other things that I really want to do, to get across? Okay, and so there's a lot of resources online for this idea of visual hierarchy. I've taken a lot of great content from the Interaction Design Foundation. And when we think about the characteristics of visual hierarchy, we think of generally size, color, contrast, alignment, repetition, proximity, and white space. There's a few others, but they're very design centric. And I think beyond the kind of the scope of what I want to do here, they require a lot more sort of design thinking and coming up with styles and different sort of textures of a presentation that again, would require sort of building something from scratch and from the ground up, and not necessarily just taking maybe what you have or what somebody else has and using these other characteristics to really polish off the design. So we'll go through these one by one. So the first one is size, right? So users, audience, viewers, they notice that larger elements are more easily than smaller ones. So in this example, like the choice of font sizes, will tell the person, probably when I first threw on this slide, this is the first, the header is obviously the first thing you probably read because of its larger size. Compared to the other elements on the page, like the bullets on there. Okay, color again is bright colors or bold colors typically attract more attention than muted ones. So again, I made the phrase visual hierarchy. I made it into this bold red color, and it's probably the first thing you might have seen after seeing the bigger headline. In maps and in graphics, we use colors when used very effectively. They make whatever point you want to make come out better. And then also you can play around with contrast. So dramatically contrasted colors or images are more eye-catching, right? As soon as I played around with the contrast of the word contrast, your eye probably went immediately to it. It can also happen in imagery. So the darker colors of Ethiopia, Senegal, and Burundi and Togo are very much not only colored but also bold in that sense, and they really make the audience pay attention to that. So these aren't, hopefully these ideas aren't so innovative to you, but again, we see this happening all the time where paying attention to them could really make a difference. Alignment is another thing. I think I spend a lot of time realigning elements on a page or on a poster that I'm given, because our eyes, our brains are sort of they're kind of evolved to pick out things that break a pattern. And sometimes you do that intentionally, like, good designers will intentionally off-center something and create some sort of visual tension, but that is deliberate and it's done, for a specific purpose and impact, to get a specific impact. A lot of times what we deal with is just slightly misaligned things like bullets or text or, just the way that the headers are aligned with the rest of the image, the way that the lines at the bottom are aligned, or logos might be aligned here. And so we want to pay attention to those sorts of things. And The next is repetition. So repetition, the repeating styles can suggest that the content's related, right? So the obvious one for text is like, let's say a bullet box, right? So we know that bullets are generally going to be related to the same issue. So in this case, the bullets that I threw up here, pretty quickly you'll see that they're related to the characteristics, their characteristics. But we can also repeat our graphics and do repetition in our visuals. And I throw this example up as well, just to show how effective repetition can be in graphics. Now, when you do that, I just want to point out that things really need to be uniform. And so you want to highlight the differences in the repetition, and you want to make sure that the similarities kind of disappear. So the choice of the gray background, the gridded layout is very important when you're doing repetition. And then using the sort of colors to an impact. Now, I use this image as just a way to illustrate repeating these repeating plots. If I were actually interested in the content and describing what's on this image, obviously I would not put it at this size, because you can tell it's very difficult to read the text on that page. So this is more just an illustration of the idea rather than exploring the content. And then there's also something that we call proximity, right? So you group things together that are related to each other, but then are also are able to be separated from one element on the page to another, right? So in this case, it's the collection of things that we call characteristics of visual hierarchy, and then just sort of other elements on the page. In this case, it's just a collection of climate-related podcasts that I had shared with students a while back. And so grouping them in a way that that tells the reader, oh, this is another section of information that I need to focus on. And then in your presentation or in the way that you build it, you can guide that person to there. And then I leave this on again, because white space is very important. It's our friend, right? And padding a space with emptiness in between is another way to sort of separate and help structure that path of the visual logic on your page. And so, putting enough white space between the image and the bullets, but just, enough that way to be greater than the space between the columns of the bullets. You think about that. So you make sure that the eye immediately sees the bullets being part of one thing and the image being part of another, putting some equidistant sort of white space inside the separation of the images, the white space that separates the source from the very bottom of the slide, and same with the top. These all matter. And when you don't do it, you end up like something closer to this, which, it's not terrible, but it's also, you can see the sort of the difference in the way that the sort of energy of the slide, or the sort of minimization of any competition for what you see. And, here, the space between the two sets of bullets and the image might, lead the reader to spend even if a couple of milliseconds of time thinking, wait, are these three bullets related to these three images or not? Right. So this is sort of how my brain kind of approaches these things. So now we're going to use an example. This is an example of an actual slide that was sent to me about 2 weeks ago by one of our scientists. And just wanted to say ahead of time that the particular slide, it was for a talk that was going to be given to a room full of mostly climate scientists, although not everyone was up to speed on the latest things that our scientist was going to present. But I'm using the example less about content discussion and more about the way that the elements are on a page, using some of the concepts that we just reviewed. And so I knew the audience was going to be more technical, so I let go of some things that normally wouldn't let go of in terms of the text and the content and what's being said. So that's just sort of a caveat there. Okay, so this is the slide. So I think, given our discussion of the past few slides, we can start to think about what are some of the better ways, what are some of the improvements that we can make the slide. And some things are done right in terms of like this text, in terms of proximity. These two things, you would say, your eye would say, okay, these belong together, these belong together, these belong together. This is, sort of massive, taking up massive visual space. It's yelling at us, so to speak, right? And is this element what we want to be the loudest on the slide? So there's competing things, right? That's presumably what the header, the headline is. There's issues about alignment that we can think about, and then the plot at the very bottom. We have to sort of think about, well, what is the point of this plot? And if the point is to actually go through the data, then we need to have this much bigger, because you can't read the labels on the plot. So this is something that could use some refining and even in breaking up, and that's what we suggested. That I suggested that we do. And then another point is that even if you wanted to animate different parts of this slide, so that perhaps like you start with the phrase prediction gap, and then you come to let these two things appear, and then the photo spread with the text many management decisions come in next, and then the new research and better models part comes in next with the plot. Even then, you're asking the eye to do a lot of zigzaggy kind of work, and again, this serves to break up the flow and the attention that the audience pays to you. So I'm going to show you what we sort of did, which the first thing is we broke it up into two slides. So this is slide 1 and this is slide 2, and I'll go back to the first one. So in this case, I realized that, right, we needed to, the point of this whole talk was about this sort of prediction gap that exists. Without going too much into the detail, we have a lot of forecast skills for weather events, certainly on the time frame of hours and days, we're pretty good. And then we have skill and seasonal outlooks, like what the next 3 months are going to give us in terms of rainfall and temperature. And the skill starts off pretty well, and then decreases over time. But then there's this gap in predictability. And so what I wanted to show, first of all, is give this image a lot more space, and then really kind of hit the point home using color, right? And utilizing the text, which I think is still a lot of text, but we sort of worked as a compromise with the scientists to make it as big as possible and utilize the white space that's inside the image to make the text as big as possible so people can read it. And we also talked about the importance of the scientists during the presentation to really kind of lay out the situation here, because we couldn't do much with the graphic in of itself other than show it given the time that we had. So I felt it needed some explaining. And the same thing for the second slide. Again, just aligning and white space, and then sort of proximity considerations, keeping the images larger. You'll notice that the logo of the project, which is important to include, but didn't have to be so loud to us. And again, had we more time, we could have explored making this plot bigger if they were going to spend a lot of time on it, and if not, just to make a point to the person giving the presentation that you kind of want to help people understand what's going on here. For those in the audience that will not know what the ECMWF is, which is the modeling center in Europe, and what MJO is bivariate correlation. These things, a lot of people in the audience might have understood, but for those that you didn't, you want to just pay attention and give them some time to do that. And same with the images. If I had more time, I'd maybe break them apart a little bit more. This came as a group of 4, right? But I think in general, we can agree that we can go from this to these two, and we help the presentation very much along. When we think about background, I would say plain light color backgrounds are going to be the best for the slides, certainly, and certainly for posters. I've seen a lot of posters with very dark backgrounds and white or offset text, and I just think in general that is harder to read. I would say a lot of designers would say, avoid white slides, like white background slides, because they could be a little bit too intense. But in the realm of research and science presentations, I think because we pull out charts and plots from other publications so often, that we're left with this sort of unintentional white framing around all the graphics that when you have a dark background can really kind of be distracting, like in this case, right? And so I think, I would say white is probably the best choice for a lot of scientific talks if you have a lot of plots and graphics that you pull out of from other sources, because then that distracting frame disappears. It's unneeded. And then keeping the backgrounds relatively simple, especially if you have other images on the field. I would say maybe for a title slide, you can play around with textures in the background because there's not a lot of content on the title slide. It's just generally a title and the author and affiliation. But on posters, I would say it's a no-no. We don't need that. It's distracting. It takes away. So for example, these sort of drops will take away from the lovely art that the artist, scientist Jill Pelto has created. And it's unnecessary, and it looks just easier on the eye if you remove that stuff. This is one from the archives that I pulled out. It's only a couple years old, but I put it up there because, in a way, it's kind of the extreme. It's in terms of violating a lot of the things we just talked about. But we can begin to understand why, when you don't pay attention to some of these principles, you just cause extra sort of dissonance and competition for attention that you don't need to. So the red, I know color is very kind of culturally dependent, but in most times around the world, red and even yellow are sort of alarm and alert. And unless you're trying to make that sort of point, you should use these colors sparingly. I think this is a backdrop of a curtain. I don't think it's necessary. The title is nice and big and easy to read, so that's great. This is a paragraph of text. We could have broken this up into different things. A couple of slides later, this happened. And so again, it's the choice of this yellow background. I'm not sure why it was necessary, but we can see that, a white background, given the size of this chart, could have been maybe a little, certainly easier on the eyes, but less visually distracting. Everything else is, I think, fine. This looks like a logo, maybe a branding template. I pay attention to where this falls on the page and why it's specifically there. And then the author chose to sort of animate the slide. And I think fancy animations like this don't really serve the purpose that we think they do. They kind of just distract. Fading in, fading out, appearing, disappearing is fine. But the animated movement of text should be used very, very sparingly. A note about type and typography. I really enjoy playing with fonts, and I have a lot of experience with that. So I don't mind trying to use new fonts in my slides. But in general, I think presentation software like Keynote and PowerPoint and others have gotten, and DeckSet is another one that I use a lot. They've gotten really well at picking good font families that work well together. I think that you can sort of generally just go for the defaults. I think that's important if you also are going to give a presentation on a different computer. A lot of times fonts that you have on your computer may not be installed in others. So I would stick to sort of the default set because that's the safest. But in general, just clear fonts. Think about who's going to be reading that font from across the poster hall, or 5 feet away or 6 feet away in a poster, or across an auditorium. Keep it simple. Use typefaces like bold and italics or underline, again, like you would use color. Like you should use it for impact, and you should use it sparingly. Otherwise, it all competes with each other on the same page. Okay, and so this gives some other sort of advice. And then one of the things that I always work on is just minimizing the amount of text on a page. And why is that? This is the one slide where I basically just paraphrase an entire web page of content because I thought it was so great from this place called Speak with Persuasion. It's making all the points that I want. But who's been in a room watching a slide that starts like that, right? And so you cannot help. And first of all, you can't help but take when there's a screen in front of you, people are going to look at the screen. And when they look at the screen, they're going to start trying to digest everything on that screen, and they're going to start reading everything. And once they start reading, they're not paying attention to you, because I can assure you, our brains can read much faster than we can speak the same content. So as I'm talking right now, I bet most of you are just reading what's on the screen, right? And sort of, just hit my point home. And we don't want that, right? Because you're the show, not the slides. They're there to see you. You all are here to hear me talk and make points on the screen for impact. But if I just wrote my script out as a sort of extreme version of that, why would you need me to be in front of the camera? And so you can reorganize this into just bullets. And so I can say all those points as I'm speaking, but I can just make them in this fashion, right? So that makes sense. I know we're all guilty of this at some point, or our colleagues are all guilty, and this is an easy fix. Photographs, and I'm mindful of the time here, so I'm going to go through some of this pretty quickly. Yes, but with photographs, I say you go big, or as a phrase is, you go home, right? How many people have seen this on a presentation? Actually, it's even worse than this. It's usually like this, right? So you have these beautiful faces, all these people tucked away in a corner that nobody can see, right? So why do that? I think you have to ask yourself, is it, do I really want to show this photo? Why? If it's that important that I'm going to take up space on the screen, why not go all the way? Same with landscape images, right? This is a mountain, beautiful mountain, hill country in Guatemala. Why would you make it so small? So, go big. You can use the space on the photo to talk about, you make some key points. You could put some text in here. You might even want to do bullets to the side, but you give that photo the life that it deserves on the page. Same with people. If you're going to show people, you want to make a point, you make it so you can see their faces. You could do it this way. You could do it this way, right? It doesn't have to be long. You don't have to sit on the slide for a minute. You just say, there were, 12 participants. Here's where they came from, and we all got to, communicate and network afterwards, and blah blah blah, right? And if you have to show two at once, again, try to give them the space that you need and make sure that they're connected in some way. Don't put two different photos for two different points. You could do that on two different slides. So here's an example. Another slide that was given to me. This is the author wanted to make some key points, and this is how they wanted to present it. Okay. And again, we see a lot of violations of some of those design principles, and really unnecessary to put it all on one slide. Even if you animate it one at a time, you still have this very cognitively dissonant sort of experience that you have. So what we did is just break it up, and also make those little text boxes, supply to demand, and these other ones about changing the culture. We made them into sort of more concrete messaging, right? So we had this and this, and then another one was this. You give the images more space, you let people absorb them. You don't have a lot of information on the page, and then they're able to pay attention to you. Color is no other single visual element has more effect on a viewer than color, right? It gets attention, it sets a mood, and it should be used judiciously and used for impact. And then I love to borrow colors from the images that we have on our slides. So if I put a nice landscape image, like I did for Guatemala, you can have a color palette that you get through that slide. And I'll show you really quickly how, through the eyedropper tool, and then through something that used to be called Culer, and now it's color.adobe.com. I love these two sites. So I have a very short video to show how I would go about doing that with this photo here. So you can click on the color. This is using Keynote. You use the eyedropper tool to maybe come up with some potential background colors, right? You can see how quickly you can change that. And like each one sets a different kind of mood. So you sort of pick one, and then once you settle on a color, let's go back to the dark one, right? You can then take the hex color value, the sort of 6 alphanumeric code, and plug it into color.adobe.com, and then you generate complementary or colors that are on the color wheel that match that specific color. And then you can decide on one of them and use that for other parts of your presentation. So in this case, I'll pick a color to make the header change. And again, this is, it took me, a minute to do, but you can start seeing how you start tying in some of these aspects into your slides, and whether or not audiences are aware of it, it does add just that little bit of polish that I think separates, design from non-design thinking. All right, so that's all I have to say for that. I think just moving quickly, charts and figures, we can spend a whole topic on this, a webinar on this, but the graphics that you put on a page, the plots should serve to reduce complexity or illustrate something that you're talking about, and facilitate sort of understanding, as we mentioned. And pay attention to the text size of the figures themselves. You may not have control over that, but you have control over how big you can make those figures. And they're, just simple ways to make plots more legible. You don't have to be sort of a data visualization expert or a master of Illustrator, but you can think about ways to take something like that. I won't get into the content, and turn it into something a little bit more where the main points are driven, using color choices or muted versus unmuted color, big text versus small text, and all the sort of hierarchical principles that we talked about. Even with Excel plots, this is sort of a standard Excel plot that, with some reimagining, you can make into this within Excel. So you make the labels bigger, you make the headline bigger, you select what part of this graph you want to highlight, which in this case would be the trend line, or not the trend line, but the line, and mute the other stuff that is not as important, right? Because simple things like that will make, and then of course you take your viewer through that. And so a couple words, final thoughts about posters. I love this illustration, right? This is what, scientists think that people want to hear. This is what viewers care about. This is a battle that comms people have for time immemorial about what to put on, especially logos. There's a lot of pressure to put a lot of logos big as possible, that I think they're not as important as most of us think they are. And then just closing thoughts, like thinking about posters, again, you can do the sort of squint method, like just squint your eyes and see which ones right off the bat, visually speaking, invite you to read more or want to read more, and which ones don't. And you can see, I think we can all agree on those that do and don't. And it's because they follow, for the most part, some of these things that we talked about. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm a little over time, but not so far over. And I'm sorry, the sun's going to start hitting my face, so.
No, it's perfect. Thank you, Francesco, for your presentation. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. We have already received some questions on the Q&A panel. If other questions want to come, we have now 10 to 15 minutes to reply to your points. The first very punctual question is from Cristina Flora. She wanted to know the name of the artist you collaborated with. You mentioned an artist at the beginning of your presentation.
Yes, her name is Niloufer Muchala. So it's a long name, but it's Niloufer, and her last name is Moochhala. And she is a longtime friend and of mine that we've collaborated over the years. Her website is called niloumakes.com, and she I think you can see some of the collaborations this collaboration that I pointed out. It's just wonderful, and I take a lot of ideas. I steal a lot of ideas from my friend.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. We have many questions, very practical questions. So your presentation inspired a lot. And I wanted to tell you that we reached 300 participants to your webinar. So It was very, very interesting for the whole world of researchers. So do you recommend researchers learning how to use products like Adobe Illustrator or others to improve things, to improve their skills? Or do you think that PowerPoint is just enough? What are the best products they should learn to use, according to you?
So I think it's always great if you have knowledge of Illustrator, because a lot of times you can modify your files, like your plots. Even if you don't make them, you can, if your collaborators do and they come as EPS files, you have a lot more options. Illustrator, there is a learning curve, but honestly, if you even learn, it's sort of like Photoshop. If you learn 5% of what Photoshop can do, and Illustrator can do, you'll have an edge. For example, I make all my posters in Illustrator because I know how to use Illustrator, and it's much better for control of layout and typography than PowerPoint is. But that's because I know how to use it. So if you have the time to learn, I would say definitely, especially Illustrator. And there are other things now like Canva and some other apps that I know people use for social media, but you can. But again, a lot of the things that I talked about in the presentation are things that you can do directly from PowerPoint or Keynote or other presentation apps.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about the font. Is there a particular font you would suggest for presentations?
So, no, I would say, like I said in the thing, you can. I mean, I have a friend whose MFA was in typography, so she studied for 2 years fonts, and so you talk about personalities of fonts and just all of these things that are just fascinating. But I think in general, for the kinds of presentations that we do, there are just really good combinations of fonts already built in to the different themes that you can at least start with in both Keynote and PowerPoint. People will say Helvetica is, sort of a classic thing, but they're like on Apple products, on Macs, for example, I like Gill Sans and Avenir. The fonts, some of the fonts that I use in the presentation are not standard. I just have them. But again, you have to worry that if you build a presentation and you don't run it on your computer, those fonts might not be on the computer who's running your presentation, and you get in trouble because then everything is messed up. So I would say, and in terms of the number of fonts, I see Guido's question there. I would say use one font family, right? But then on a given page, really pay attention to how many variations of that font you're using, not only in terms of size, but in terms of faces, like bold and extra light or light. Don't combine too many on one page, and really be consistent with it across the pages. So your headers are always the same, your bullet text is always the same, and the like. And then use bold or even colored text for a specific impact you want to get across. And yeah.
Okay, there is another point about animations. Do you suggest to use, this is Sophie Peter who asks, how much animations should we use in a presentation? Yeah. And also Guido Ascenso asked earlier about your slide presenting the visual logic or hierarchy. Why you choose to have the bullet points visible from the start rather than making them appear one at a time?
Yes, so those are great questions. And I think in that particular case, I mean, you'll see that the rest of the presentation, a lot of the slides have one at a time. And I would recommend that. I would not recommend fancy. And I mean, I see people like have their bullets like drive across the screen one at a time. That's very distracting and unnecessary. But appearing them one at a time generally is a better way to do it. In that particular slide, because I was going to have so many versions of that slide, I didn't want to spend a lot of time doing the 5 or 6 or 7 characteristics of visual hierarchy. So I just put them up because they're essentially one word. And I think people can, that's sort of okay. If they were like phrases, then I would probably have broken them down. But in general, animating them to appear in a non-distracting way is better, especially if you're trying to make very complicated points of research or presenting data.
Another question is about the sound in presentations. Can a background music be a way to capture attention or a distracting figure?
Unless it's sound that you're playing for, a part of a presentation, like, like let's say for that screen recording that I played, I wanted to record the clicks of my mouse so that people can pay attention where I am on the screen. That's good. Background music. I've never seen a presentation with background music that wasn't anything but distracting, unless it's intimately tied to what you're saying. I mean, you might be giving a talk about climate musician collaborations or science musician collaborations, and then for a bit of it, you want to play some of that in the background. But otherwise, it is literally background noise. You can't. You want to be front and center in terms of the audio. You, the speaker.
Let's jump a bit into your experience. So Cristina Flora also asks if your expertise is a new kind of job title, or are there any courses, paths to learn tools to collaborate with researchers for graphics? How do you get here? What kind of expertise is yours?
Yeah, so I have the benefit of on average being a communications department of one over the years, right? So what happens in those cases that you have to fulfill the responsibilities that you need for communications, but then you could kind of personalize it to your specific skill set. So I pushed a lot in improving the way that we visually communicate. I think there are jobs as part of communications teams. For example, the climate school has such, a few people like that are communications people, but that focus on, let's say, building interactive graphics or timelines or what have you as part of, web communications, or people that focus more on reports and layout that are not necessarily 100% graphic designers, but that sort of straddle both. If there is a specific job title for what I do, I haven't seen it yet, but I've kind of, had the luxury of being able to define my work as needed, to match my interests over the years. And I forgot the other part of the question, but yes, there are plenty of resources and training for improving the way that you communicate visually as a researcher, and even as a comms person. I will look for some, maybe send them to you, Alessandra, and then you can share them with folks. But there's a lot of stuff online as well.
Thank you. It will be useful. We can put them available on the webpage of the event if you can send us some material. Also, you said this material is useful both for researchers and communication people. We have a question from one of these, who is Margherita Chiara. She is a recent graduate in science communication, and she asks if you have any advice for someone who is trying to start a career in science communication in particular.
Well, so I would say, so there's advice about just career building and networking that I think maybe it's not exact, so there's, making sure that you have a presence on LinkedIn and these other, being part of conversations on social media and networking in that way, very important, because and then the other thing that I think that I've appreciated as somebody now in the field and didn't appreciate so much when I was starting out is reaching out to communications people who you like and who you see yourself following in their path, asking them for an informational meeting. I think most people in our positions would love to speak to young people, early career people, about the work that they do and hear, what others are interested in, because our field is, fairly small, and certainly in the academic realm. And when it comes time, in the few and far times that we have to hire people, we go back to the folks that we know and that have had conversations with or have met. And so the networking part is extremely important, and don't be afraid to ask for a meeting. I've had like 2 or 3 in the last few years, from anywhere from high school students to recent grads that wanted to do science comms, and they've been very enjoyable. And I also learn a lot, right? Because we can't keep up all the time on the sort of new things that are emerging from our field, or new issues that people are concerned with. I don't know if that answers fully the question, but reach out and I'll have a nice meeting with you on Zoom.
Great. I go back to practical question now, because we are receiving many. Do you recommend to use images with jokes or comics in presentations?
Yes, I do. And I would, but again, you don't want to make, I do, and I have mostly when I lecture, because sometimes your lectures are an hour and a half, or your class is that long. And so you could make a point with a cartoon or an image or something to give, people a little bit of a reset in their attention effectively. But you have to make sure that you put that in a point where a point in your presentation where you can let people relax a bit and read what's on the screen. You don't have, I wouldn't, read it out like a cartoon caption. I would just say, so, for example, the one I put from Better Posters, the Venn diagram, I put that up there as a little bit of a comic relief, right? Because we all can relate to it. So I would say, as long as the cartoon is appropriate and relevant to what you're going to say or have been talking about, it's great. And just time it in a presentation where you feel like people need a little bit of a breathing room. It's been a long set of slides. You want them to take a break and enjoy themselves and have a laugh, and then go back to other things. But yeah, I'm for that. Maybe the older I get, the more I want to use them, because I'm a corny dad, at this point.
We have a question from one of our researchers at CMCC, Sergio Noce, who asks if when designing a presentation, it is useful to use a progress bar, a bar which progresses as the presentation goes on.
Yes, I mean, it is useful. I don't think it's always necessary. I've always appreciated that when it's there. It's just an extra thing that you sort of have to do in a presentation that, if it weren't for, say, like just lack of time, that I would build that more into it. I mean, but again, using good visual, it should not be so overwhelming on the page that it's going to take away from every single slide. And it doesn't have to be on every slide either. It could be on sections. So this is, like a little pie chart that you're on, 3 out of 5 parts that you've completed. I think that's always very helpful and effective if done in a minimal way that doesn't take away from the content on the page.
Another question is about if you can find a general rule on how to reduce the amount of data that you put on the charts. Because in Earth Science, says Vanya Blazika, there are lots of data and scientists want to show them as much as possible. Yeah. How can we reduce data?
Yeah, so it's always, so let's talk about slides, right? Because posters are a little hard, but they're also for a different set of audiences. For slides, like I mentioned in a few of those things that I showed, sometimes you have to put what you have, right? Because maybe the chart and the data that you are taking from, either you don't have the skills to remake it or the time to remake it in a clear way, or you don't have the rights to do it. So you just sort of take it from a colleague's publication and you put it up. But this is when the sort of presenter as guide comes into play. And so there are a lot of techniques where if you show a very complicated thing, there are cues that you can use as a speaker to say, I know this is a lot to look at, but I want you to pay attention to the green thing. And then all of a sudden the user's attention is, okay, all of this extra data that's on the screen is now reduced to the one thing that I want to show you. The other way to do it is to, well, first of all, make it as visible as possible. And then again, using visual cues like this, an asterisk next to what part of the data you're showing and talking about, I think just helps people manage the anxiety, that a lot of non-science people will feel when they see a complicated graphic. And you might just joke, you might just say as a researcher, just say, or encourage a researcher to say, I know this is a lot that I'm throwing at you, but what this graph shows is that in the last 20 years, temperatures have done this much or have done something. And then you start to point out things on the data. And I think guiding them through that is important. The other thing is that oftentimes, a researcher might want to put in 4 charts when really one could make the point that they want to make, or they have to choose. You have to help them choose which one is the most important one and then go through that. If it's for a public audience, if it's for an audience of mostly scientists, then, in general, training of scientists means that they can absorb information quickly. But, I think that it's always a challenge.
Another challenge is the one posed by Antonio Grassa, I think. I hope to spell it right, who asks, what are your recommendations for a post-lunchtime presentation to capture attention and stop people dozing off?
Yes. So as somebody who's had to moderate more than one panel at the post-lunchtime slot, this is something that is very, I can relate to. I think this is where you, as the presenter, might ease off in the beginning, right? With a lot of complicated slides, sort of slowly bring in, organize your presentation in a way that you start with some maybe powerful photos or images. Cartoons would be a good place for this as well. But then also my trick is to make it very interactive. And I even joke, there's one time where I sort of got up in front of people. I said, all right, I know, I said, is everyone as sleepy as I am right now? Because we just had a good meal and, it's maybe, it's very warm in here and the lights are dimming and people laugh, right? So as soon as you get them laughing, so you kind of engage in that way, but then you have to be more mindful, especially in that critical time or at the end of the day, where you're going to have people dozing off. So you can ask them questions, or you can say, like if I was giving this webinar after lunch and I put the example slides up, this is hard to do over Zoom, but I would have stopped and said, hey, people, just shout out what's wrong with this slide. What do you think is a problem with this slide? And then all of a sudden people hear others talking and then you get a little bit more action. Short of, feeding everyone stimulants and espresso.
Ambra Assor asks, time is running out because we should have stopped at 2, but we have so many questions. If you agree,
I'm fine.
I would ask a couple of more
Absolutely.
questions. Okay, thank you. What do you think about mind map or mind tree visual contents on a slide presentations? It's great for the logic highlight, but also shows that the talking flow slows the talking flow and have it the point sometimes. So what's your suggestion?
So I think I understand. I hope I understand the question. So using like mind maps, and I've if you're using the mind map to organize the whole presentation, I'm not sure. You have to be very careful. Like if there are like apps like Prezi that people use where they sort of have this big image and then they zoom into one part and then sort of zoom out to the next part, the next branch of the map or the tree. I think that's fine, but again, it requires orchestration on your part and not to make these transitions too extreme that people get, dizzy or nauseous. If that's sort of the idea that you have, then I think it could be very effective and engaging, but it has to be done again. Don't go overboard. It's the same with animations on a screen. You can have things appear and disappear, but if you start having things spiral into the screen, it becomes very distracting. If it's showing a mind map that you've created and that you want to go through, then again, you could, and it's on a static slide, let's say, you can break up that mind map into multiple slides and like just sort of cut it into either thirds or quadrants, show the whole thing and just say, I'm going to approach it now in these 4 steps. And again, you take the person through it step by step so that they don't get overwhelmed. I don't, without seeing an example, it's hard for me to answer the question perfectly. I hope I got at some of that though.
I would ask maybe the last question for a question of timing. What is Guido Ascenso asks? What is the process when you try to fix a client presentation? In terms of what steps you take and in what order, but also in terms of how much you reach a compromise between what you think looks best on a slide and what the client wants to keep on the slide. How can convince a client to remove 90% of their precious text?
Yeah, so again, I have the benefit of having worked with my colleagues for a long time, so they know what I'm going to say and I know what they're going to say. But I think in general, what I try to do is, first of all, it's important. I'm always cognizant. You need to talk to them about who they're giving the talk to, right? And so, for example, if I know they're going to give this talk to a technical conference or scientific conference, then I'm going to back off on what I say about the graphs and the plots and how complicated it is, right? Because I know that this is the point of going to a conference, is you show your latest research findings, right? So understanding who they're supposed to be relating to is important. And then I would say, you want to keep their voice, right? You don't want to make their presentation into your presentation, right? Because I know that if I were going to talk about what they're going to talk about, I would do it in a completely different way. And that's not the point, right? The point is they're the ones that have committed their life and career to this topic, perhaps, and dedicated many years to the research. And so they're the ones that you want to put forth and make them shine. I would say a lot of times, I can become persuasive by taking the time to redo a few of their slides to show them what I mean, and to show them that I'm not necessarily suggesting that we cut out everything, but that we feed it to the audience, not in a giant bowl all at once, but in spoons, right? And so even with a complicated graph, I say, what if we drew a circle around this part and you talk about this, and then we drew another circle around this part and then you talk about this. You can keep that graph, but now you've enabled engagement to different audiences. And it's a back and forth. But I think the way that I can prove my point most effectively about visual communication is to show them what I have in mind, and then we can compromise. Somebody might say, no, that logo is critical because there's the program managers in the audience and we need to show that. So I say, okay, so let's do it here. Or maybe you want a special slide for affiliate, thanks and credits and affiliations to the people that funded you. And so that we can have it back and forth. But what you don't want to do is just say, I don't like it at all, I'm going to redo it for you, and here are my color choices and here are my font choices, and this is better. It's not. It's a value judgment. But if you're on a shared mission of communicating clearly, then there are sort of value-based things that you can do to your slides that just help in that way in terms of hierarchy.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. I must stop, but I want to say people who sent them their questions that we will, of course, share them with the speaker, with Francesco, because we also received some requests to be in contact with you for collaboration. So we want to share the question with you.
Great, I'll do my best to answer as many as possible through you.
Thank you. We want to thank Francesco. Thanks to everybody for participating in today's webinar. And the discussion was so interesting that we can for sure continue in following events or occasions to go in depth in this topic, which is very important for our researchers and communication staff in the world of research. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Francesco, for the outstanding presentation.
Thank you, and for having me participate in this. It's been really great, and I look forward to the responses and the reactions. So thanks again for putting on this whole series.